Welcome to the Graduate Writing Series online workshops. This installment explores the conventions of academic argument and the position paper. It is sponsored by the Graduate Writing Center at Loyola, where graduate-level peer tutors are ready to help with all your day-to-day writing needs. So what does the professor mean when they ask you to make an argument? What is the work that a graduate position paper is supposed to accomplish? The answer, in a nutshell, is that the writer must synthesize source materials and use evidence to support a compelling line of reasoning. Simply put, the position paper is a tool for organizing your notes or research into an organized policy statement. In order to make an effective position paper, you have to communicate to your readers the kinds of situations or problems in which the policy will be applied, the parameters of the policy itself, including its limits and exceptions, and most importantly, a clear train of reasoning that explains why the adopted policy is preferable to other explicitly discussed options, i.e. comparing and contrasting. In the next few slides, we're going to cover the basic elements of a graduate position paper. In this slide, we're going to talk about introducing a claim. A position paper is meant to be a persuasive piece of writing. That means two things. First, at a higher level, it means that there is usually not a clear right answer or best practice already in place. Researchers use the occasion of the position paper to try to establish best practices where they are most needed in their field. So you need to build a case. Second, writing persuasively means every word in your paper is carefully chosen and positioned to convince your readers that your take on the issue is the best one available given the circumstances you've outlined. Consequently, the introduction of your paper should present the appropriate background and description of the problem to be discussed in a way that leads to your main claim. At the very least, you should state the problem and explain why it matters in your field. Your claim, which follows that statement of the problem, is the position you want your community to take on the issue at hand. Your claim is what you will support with reasoning and evidence. For example, a claim statement in the field of school counseling might read as follows. To ensure students from diverse backgrounds have access to college after high school, contemporary school counselors must focus their efforts exclusively on college and career counseling. After introducing your claim, the first part of the position paper uses sources to present context for the problem at hand and to provide insight into the ongoing disagreement. The second part of the paper then begins to break down the nuances of the problem, explaining and exploring its twists and turns. There may not be an overt argument that you're entering. You may be asked to distinguish between philosophical approaches or different strategies. Whatever the case, you must begin to unpack your reasoning to show how your claim or your position addresses these different aspects or points of view of the problems in your field. Reasons support claims. They often follow the word because, as in, I believe X because. Every reason contains an underlying assumption, and it's important to be aware of what your reasoning assumes, because to be persuasive, you must choose the reasons where audience is most likely to share those assumptions. Here's an example of a claim and reason. The United States is justified in using drone strikes to kill suspected terrorists without a trial or criminal conviction in a court of law when the threat of mass destruction is demonstrably imminent. The underlying assumption there is that it's okay for the U.S. government or its agents to kill citizens of other countries without due process of law if they pose an imminent threat to others. This is something that many people in our society are arguing and take a position on. But to be convincing with this line of reasoning or any other, you have to be prepared to show some evidence. All significant reasoning in any argument should be supported with evidence. By evidence, we mean facts, examples, summaries of research articles, statistics, testimony, quotes, citations, or any other relevant data that will persuade your readers to accept your particular line of reasoning. Typically, your evidence should come from course readings and be cited appropriately. Some evidence is based in common sense, such as a persuasive analogy or conjecture about the consequences of a particular action, or a chain of connected points. The quality of evidence is typically evaluated by 4 common criteria. First, sufficiency asks, do you have enough evidence to persuade readers to take action? The second, applicability, asks, is the data in evidence representative and exactly applicable to the issue at hand? Third, accuracy, asks, is your data accurate and up to date? And fourth, relevance, asks, does your data pertain specifically to your claim? In an argument or persuasive paper, a writer must anticipate possible objections to their reasoning or counter-arguments and begin to address them. Understanding what the objections are to your position is one of the most challenging aspects of critical thinking. This understanding comes from research, and it comes from role-playing. The ability to step outside your own perspective, put aside what you personally believe, and see an issue from another person's point of view is a skill that takes practice and is vital to successful argument. To continue with the example that I gave earlier concerning the U.S. role in combating terrorism, a writer would have to begin to imagine why someone would object to U.S. Special Forces assassinating Osama bin Laden in the middle of the night on foreign territory. Should the U.S. have asked the Pakistani government to step in and arrest him? A Pakistani citizen might think the U.S. should have respected the sovereignty of that nation's laws and territorial borders. So a position paper on this topic should anticipate and address this type of counter-argument. In fact, all successful argumentative writing, understands and thoroughly explores opposing viewpoints. Sometimes the opposing views are perfectly valid, and other times they're questionable, so there are a couple of different strategies available to you depending on the credibility of your opposition. There are 3 common ways of handling opposing views in a position paper. When a writer runs up against a line of reasoning that contradicts their own, they might concede that specific point entirely, modify their own claim, or refute the opposing claim entirely. Let's take a closer look at concessions. What is a concession? A concession is what you do when the other side makes a good point. You admit it. It isn't enough to convince you overall, but the point that's been made is valid, and you know your audience would accept it as such. In that case, allow the other side to be a little bit right, but use it as an occasion to draw clear limits around the extent of their correctness. For example, in the case of Osama bin Laden, one might argue that the U.S. should have let the Pakistani police handle the arrest and trial. However, you might try to argue that that particular case is only the exception and not the rule, and explain how your point might still be valid. Modification is another technique you can turn to when the other side makes a point that is true, but only in a limited sense, or in circumstances that don't completely invalidate your claim. In that case, you can use their objection as an opportunity to clarify your own point. For example, as a general rule, the U.S. should and does allow local governments to handle arrests on their own soil. However, the case of Osama bin Laden presents an opportunity to look at the special circumstances under which the U.S. or any other nation might act outside of its own sovereignty. Lastly, you might choose to simply deny the validity of an opposing point. For example, calling the Pakistani police sounds like a nice thing to do, but the U.S. is an exceptionalist state that does not need to follow international laws or protocols when the safety of its own citizenry is at stake. As you move to wrap up your position paper, you must begin to pull all the threads of your argument together in a way that leads to the inevitability of your claim. This is called synthesis. Synthesis means bringing together different sources for your own purposes. Synthesis is the art of problem negotiation and resolution, finding provisional solutions, making new ideas, posing new uses for existing research, and expressing your own voice in an ongoing scholarly discourse. Synthesis is a way of coming to terms with the complexity that results when multiple interpretations of multiple texts are in play. It's part of the dialectical thinking process in which sources are presented in conversation with one another. Classically speaking, synthesis is a resolution forged in the collision of opposing ideas. Graduate writers use it to carve out their own thinking spaces based on secondary research. Wrestling with the conflicting ideas from different texts, writers try to forge a new and coherent potentiality that represents their own unique voice in the conversation. Typically, a graduate-level position paper will have to wrestle with shades of gray. As we said before, it's very likely there will not be a clear right or wrong answer. That means there's an opportunity for you to make sugar from someone else's water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. Ethical work links encounters with source material to each step in the process of articulating a position. These sources should be used transparently and cited in the style of your professional field. Don't forget, at the graduate level, all of the steps we have been discussing so far are influenced by sources discovered through research, critical reading, class lecture, and/or discussion. Because our culture tends to be very argumentative, we tend to view these debates as commonplace. Graduate-level writing, however, must go beyond the commonplace. To do that, writers must use and cite sources whenever possible. So let's review and think for a moment about the different sections of your paper and what they should accomplish. In the first section, you want to make sure that you introduce and outline the policy or practice in question and explain what factors contributed to those policies being established in the first place. In section 2, you want to address the benefits and costs specific to your context and the measures key actors have taken to maximize or minimize those effects. Section 3, you'll outline your particular interest in the issue being discussed and explain what has or needs to be changed in the current situation to warrant a re-examination or redirection of policy or practice. And finally, in section 4, you want to discuss the areas that need reform and provide concrete suggestions as to how this revision process should be accomplished. And of course, all along the way, you're documenting your ideas, your points, and your counterpoints with evidence from sources. Lastly, as a writer, it's important to remember that these are skills that you develop over time with practice and attention to detail and focus and good coaching, just like anything else. So it's important to try and set aside a little bit of time to practice and to seek out some advice from people with more experience than yourself. Here are a couple activities that you can explore that might connect you to your professor or writing center tutor.